Usually the first question is, we need to move, and where do we start? So I will tell you, as a landlord, the first thing that we will ask you is, do you have a business plan? That is A1 first question. Can you afford the space that you're looking for, and do you have a plan to move forward? You know, we do like to see previous business finance reports if you're an established company. But if you're just starting up, that business plan is probably the one thing that's going to differentiate you and bring more value to a landlord.
Yeah, and one thing I would kind of chime in, I've heard a few of the companies in the room, New York Life, previous client, and G-Commerce, another large company. Some of what we'll talk about today is tailored towards just the elementary discussion, but some of you folks are with some major companies that have either real estate directors or you're making decisions for the third or fourth time. So knowing the audience a little bit more, we'll probably add a little bit more broad discussion to lease versus some potentially ownership discussion, which Brandon might get into. And then, how is it different if you're an employee with the organization working with a real estate director? So we'll broaden maybe a little bit and go off the slides that we have here to try to address the audience and those that are online as well.
So the next question is, how do we differentiate our space from our competitors? I've really found this kind of market of today to be very interesting because you're able to kind of go outside the bounds a little bit. With East Village, you have historic preservation sites that are able to do not just, it was built as a transmission building to build transmissions for vehicles, and now it's law firms. There's some unique things in our market to kind of differentiate yourself, but Brandon can definitely talk about that.
I think a lot of these are questions that, we kind of talked a little bit about our bios, and so it's Dan, Daniel, Justin, and Brandon in order from right to left or your left to right. We have different backgrounds and experiences, and I think what's fun to be on this panel today is that we can look at things from different lenses, and there may be questions that you're asking or thinking about that will probably come out with a different perspective, but likely it will end up in a similar place. What we talked about here, these are definitely not all of the questions that folks have when they're starting a business and opening their first office, or if they're moving for the fifth time, as a 50-year-old organization. But likely these are the things that the decision-making group or the owner are thinking. And it's important that you do think about that because ultimately you need to really have clarity because this is a big decision for your business, your organization, whatever that is. We're going to talk a little bit about workforce attraction, retention. It's also your customer attraction and retention. You need to also fit out your facility in a way that it represents your culture. It's extremely important. And so we're going to get into some of that. But these are all the things that I think probably are weighing on you if you're at the point of making this type of decision or investment. And so we wanted to make sure that we recognize that as industry professionals. And what we try to do is help you alleviate those concerns. And Dan mentioned a business plan. What we all want to do is create a strategic real estate plan that matches your business plan. And if we do that, when you're done, you're going to be really happy about your space and in your flexibility to evolve as an organization.
Yeah, and being a real estate professional and seeing a lot of different types of users, different types of needs, it's fun to be able to go through some of those strategies on making sure you find the right place to accomplish all of your goals. So how can we trust for who can we trust for all of our real estate needs? And I think we're going to get into the team that you need to establish, but you really do need to have a team of professionals to be able to accomplish everything from finding the right space, negotiating the lease, and then also being able to open. So those are all things that your team should be able to help you do.
And to expand on that, he spoke about the real estate needs. Another thing, if you're a small business or an organization in general, looking to expand, your team is going to be more than just real estate. You'll need a real estate attorney. You might consult with a CPA, an architect, an engineer. So depending on your certain needs on what you're going to be doing, whether it's, you know, leasing, buying, developing, all those certain things, you're going to require different team members that you're going to need to assemble. So the team itself, the real estate team, and then the team of all the outside things that fit your box and what you're looking to accomplish.
And one plug for the commercial real estate agents out there is our commission is paid by the landlord. So if you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is going to cost me a whole lot to have this expertise, my services don't cost you anything. Now, Brandon does cost a little bit, but I can tell you, every penny that you spend with somebody like him, you will save more than you'll ever be able to count. So,
Right. There's different ways for cost structure, and be happy to show you the difference in brokerage commissions versus our fees at some point. But no, it is. It's the way the market works. It's a very valuable service. You know, you need architects or space planners. You need to make sure that the space you're potentially leasing or buying fits what your business program is, and hopefully you've done some planning work with that. You know, you're a design expert to make sure you're planning appropriately. You also need to be able to cost the construction. You need to have a legal team to review your lease and make sure you have the right flexibility, or you're willing to accept the risk, you know, profile that you're putting upon yourself or your organization. And lastly, I would say you need to have a group of people that you feel very comfortable moving forward with that's going to help take some of this pressure off your shoulders and kind of give you this confidence in decision making. Because without it, it can be a very stressful situation. I know there's a few folks in here that are doing that for their organizations now. And if you don't get the team and if you can't work with them, it can be a really big challenge and it can be very stressful. So we're not trying to scare everybody, but it's definitely doable. There's many different delivery methods. You can do it where there's no cost. Ultimately, you're going to pay a fee somewhere. Let's be realistic. There's money going somewhere for these services. But Dan is correct. A lot of the way the market works today, as a tenant, you have the ability to bring on a team for either no fee or a very low fee to get all the services you need to move into the process. Now from there, you're still paying for your space or your build out or your furniture. You know, that's going to be market rate as you deem appropriate, determining the level of fit and finish for your space. So, and I think we can get into that a little later. But it is really important to build the right team, to make sure you're considering the right use type. You know, these are kind of basic business decisions, but as you look in the market, different areas and different types of product on the market are going to fit your business. I would say the way that the architecture is evolving and, you know, the open collaborative spaces that we seem to see popping up, you can really convert a lot of spaces into different use anymore. With that said, you still may have some zoning restrictions, and you may have some restrictions that the landlord has based on other users in the facility. So the team can help you navigate those waters and make sure you don't get yourself into a bad predicament.
So, you know, what type of space do we need, since we're skipping the business plan section because we've already done that? What I'll tell you is, usually for us, location, location, location. You know, Trump says it. You know, that's huge. It truly is the deciding factor on most things. So it's going to determine everything from your cost per square foot, your taxes that will be passed through to you. It'll be affecting the municipal code and what are the restrictions on those appropriate uses within that area. So location is probably the biggest differentiating factor for all things with real estate.
Just out of curiosity, within the room, how many people are looking or would be looking for like a retail space versus a pure office type of space? Retail, mostly? That seems to be where we get most of, at least from my perspective. And again, my personal role is a pure broker role. So we list property, we represent people in finding locations. We kind of do both. It's a small market, so people in this role tend to do that. Retail tends to be the one where we get the most questions. I just told these guys today, I was at a showing in East Village, and it was a first-time operator. She wanted to open a coffee shop up, had no idea about anything other than the space was about 700 square feet, and there was a rate attached to it. And and that, I get that call every single day. So this is where it goes to the concept of having the right team, doing the right research, and really taking your time to kind of figure out, A, what your use is, and then B, how does that fit within kind of a cost model of the overall different types of uses. So we'll talk more about that within the process itself, but glad to kind of see that perspective.
And retail is the highest cost out of all the sectors in commercial real estate. And usually the cost that's associated with that is driven by traffic counts, co-tenancy, and also the signage that is available. That's the other differentiating factor for a retail space is there signage available and increasing my visibility to more people. You know, you can go into a less visible space, but then how much more are you going to have to spend on marketing and advertising? Barada's old theme was, well, you'll like us if you can find us. So, not a great retail strategy, especially if when you're trying to attract a lot of people to see and know where you are.
I was just going to say, to expand on the retail locations, a lot of it, the reason too that it costs so much is it's specialty fit. So, you know, if you're going in and, for Justin's example, building out a coffee shop, and you're putting in the plumbing and all, you know, the things that go along with a coffee shop, tenant leaves, then all of a sudden you either get a coffee shop or you have to tear the space apart. Or there's a lot of issues that the landlord has to do to get the space to get to where it needs to be for the next user. Also, generally the underlying real estate, this is just getting, I don't know, it's a little more than basic, but the underlying real estate on the corner of Main and Main is going to cost a little more than the underlying real estate, say, in an industrial park. So the costs are just generally higher for all the things that you need for a retail space.
Taxes.
Exactly.
Taxes.
Amongst other things.
And then office, one caveat to office is a lot of times it doesn't allow you to do a whole lot of signage. And that's another thing that kind of goes into that. There are some really cool concepts that are out there for office, for co-working spaces, all the way up to, you know, full-on industrial conversions with 20-foot high ceilings and amenity-rich, fun things. So you'll see that out on the market. Flex, to give you another term out there, flex, what that means is you have a little bit of office or retail, and then a little bit of warehouse as well. So those can have roll-up doors. They can accommodate someone such as like a woodworker that would like to have some retail space but also wants to have a shop and back. Flex is a pretty hot segment right now in Des Moines and getting harder to find spaces. And then the industrial user, that's a new darling in our industry with everything being kind of converted for e-commerce, distribution. All of that is being led because of the growth in the industrial market, and the higher rental rates are definitely getting higher because data centers, distribution, all of those things fall under industrial. And then code requirements. One of the biggest reasons to get a real estate agent, we help you with the site location, but we also know how to navigate through the municipal codes. We know how to navigate through some of the other things that you'll find. You know, thinking that you can do, I had this experience, a restaurant goes in, buys a bar. They thought, no problem, we'll be able to just go ahead. You know, we're not as bad as a bar in the eyes of the city council and everything else. And then, sure enough, the city came in and said, no, this was zoned for a bar. It has to be a bar. You cannot have a kitchen in this space. So those are all things that we see every day, and we can avoid some of those potholes or some of those things that might come your way based on zoning, municipal codes of the city and county.
Should we change the slide here? You got it, Dan. Sorry. There we go. All right, so we've kind of hit on quite a bit so far already, so let's kind of back it up and where do we start? I think at a minimum, and Dan hit on this, at a minimum, you know, find a tenant rep, you know, in the market to help you look for space. I think so many times people think that if they're a retail user or a small office user coming out of their garage or basement, they're going to spend extra money, and it's just, I'll go talk to the landlord. And the landlords would like you to do that. And that can be okay if you have some level of knowledge, but I would say at a minimum, bring on a professional. It does not cost anything. The landlords are expecting to pay those commissions. And to be honest, for a small space, it's not a significant amount of money, to be honest.
And I would just echo one thing, because this isn't meant to sound like a commercial for brokerage or professional services, but to be honest with you, the biggest advantage of at least engaging somebody at an initial level is to save yourself time. A lot of these folks are doing this every day, and when you pose a 5-minute conversation about here's what I need, here's what I'm looking for, they'll give you kind of a lot of the stuff that you need before you would even have to sign anything formal. And a lot of times you don't even have to sign anything formal. So I would just say as an initial step one, not as a requirement, but as a time saver for yourself, just call somebody and start asking a ton of questions. And 9 times out of 10, I know I take those calls all the time. You know, they obviously don't always lead to transactions, which is fine. Sometimes the best conversations I have is that small business owner that reaches out and says, hey, here's kind of what I'm looking for. We'll have a really good talk about it. And the next thing you know, everything that they thought is completely different. And that's okay. You don't have to do it, but I think it would save you time on the front end.
Yeah, and that's a lot of it's the relationships, because our hope is your businesses grow and we provided value, and then we're able to help you down the road. So again, I agree with Justin 100%. As you start to get, you know, to be a little bit larger business, maybe your second move or you're expanding rapidly, you know, you really want to develop a core team that can look through those lenses we mentioned earlier. So understanding the layout of the space, the cost of the space, how you're going to run those costs over time, what assets you're amortizing or depreciating, flexibility with your lease, so make sure you have your attorney. There's a certain level you need to step up. You know, you really need to build that team. And then for the larger organizations, they actually have that, like the Nationwides or Principals, they have that team in-house, and they selectively bring in folks, and they're definitely going to do that, and at a level that would not be realistic for most organizations. So it's finding the balance for where you're at and where your business or organization is at, and then just making sure that you feel like you have all those lenses covered.
And I'll put it in a pitch, not to sound, but lawyers are not just lawyers. They have specific roles that they do. I wouldn't go see an orthopedic surgeon for my dental needs, you know? There are specific people that work in this sector that I would say use those professionals. They know what they're doing. They know what they see every day. They know what to expect of the market. You know, what are some things that the market just requires of you. I got to tell you, some of the worst, you know, representation is the people that just don't know what they're doing. And so if you have an aunt that's a real estate agent, great. But if that aunt is not a commercial real estate agent, they just don't know the lingo. When I put up my house for sale, I used a residential real estate agent to do that, because I don't deal in that world at all. So.
Yep. So, in summary, you know, it is important to build the team at whatever the appropriate level is, and from there, it is making sure you're taking time with that team and, you know, a select body or however big your organization is to, you know, take time to plan and evaluate your needs thoroughly. Do not just make reactionary decisions because a similar business has this size of layout, so that's what I need. That may get you close, but likely you're going to be upset about a few of the things because that's not how your business works. So take the time to do that, define your needs, set your goals, and evaluate your criteria. There's many different ways to do that. There's great professionals in our market, so you can call from, you know, all the way up and down the list. There's a lot more than the folks here at the table that can help you with that. So you're in good hands. And I would say, again, we've talked about the lenses to look at from the specific project, but one thing that we do, and we talked about this, and I think in some way everybody does this, is you're looking at your space through 4 typical lenses. So it's the functionality. Does it work for my business? it's the form. Is the fit and finish appropriate? Do I have the level of, is this the ambiance, the culture I'm trying to create? Does the form provide me flexibility if I'm a rapidly growing organization? Does it provide me with some legal outs because of early termination rights or either easy growth routes with expansion rights? What is your form of economy? So what is your cost structure? Have you actually have a business plan, especially if you're new or existing? Do you know what your revenue is and what you can afford to spend on your real estate costs? So you're making sure you're looking there. And then time. What's your timing for all this? Put those lenses together. I think it sounds pretty basic, but a lot of times some of those get missed. And then when decisions are made, you look back and you say, I'm out of space in 2 years and I've got 7 more years here and this building can't get any bigger. So then you have a big challenge there. And then you potentially put yourself in a situation with some pretty big sunk costs. So just things to look for. If you do that, you're going to put yourself in a really, the best position you can. And then as Justin said, the big part of this is leveraging your team to act on your behalf so you can do what you do. If you're a dentist or if you're a business professional or an attorney, whatever that case may be, if you're a restaurant, you need to get preparing other things. Obviously, your space is important, but leverage that power. So anything you guys want to add to that?
I'll just comment on timing. I mean, that's one of the biggest things. Sorry, I'm vocal. I'm a broker. I talk a lot. I get a lot of calls from folks that need something within 60 days. And we'll touch a little bit more on the total process. We've kind of gone a little bit there. But while you can find quick opportunities that are turnkey and ready to go, frankly, it's the norm to not do that. You're usually doing a kind of an extended search, right? There's some comment where you see 100 residential houses before you pick the right one. It's probably not that many, but from a commercial standpoint, I do tours where we'll look at 20 properties, no less. And even before we've gotten to that point, there's a larger digital search that we've conducted to say, yeah, maybe I don't want to be in West Des Moines for these reasons. I want to be in Ankeny for this reason. So then you zero in on that submarket. That takes time. Once you get into that submarket, you got to kind of identify what opportunities are there today, which ones are coming available. Again, that takes time. The actual transaction itself is just a whole other part of that. So we've done deals, I think probably all of us, where somebody found the right space, they can take it as is, and they walk in and it's perfect. But that tends to be the rarity than the norm. So time to me is a really important part of the total process. Figure out when you got to be in. And in my usual estimation, 6 months is about the right length for a transaction that goes through a full search, goes through a full construction process, and then negotiates a full lease. Can certainly be sooner, can also be longer.
And you also have to be able to back out of a deal if it is not good or in your best interest. That's another thing that it takes a hard decision to be able to know when it's not good for you. We got to the signing table on a restaurant, found out some really bad news at the last minute, and had to scrap a lot of time and effort and investment. So those are also things that you should probably be aware of: time, and then also flexibility.
Great. Let's move to the next.
We'll go kind of quickly through this because it feels like we're overlapping a lot of the topics. So wanted to provide kind of a quick step-by-step of, if you've never done it before, where do you start kind of thing. The obvious one is finding the space. I just touched on determining the right market. The type of space you're seeking can a lot of times determine the right market. So without getting into too much detail there, you gotta zero in on the space. So say we've done that. The next thing that Brandon kind of talked a lot about is you've got the space. What do I need to do to make it work for me? If I'm a retailer, there's probably specific things. If I'm an office user, maybe there's offices all over the exterior. Well, we want the new forward neighborhood collaboration concept, so we're ripping all those out. So it's really establishing what needs to happen within the space itself for it to work for you. The biggest thing that I get, especially from people looking for space for the first time, is really understanding cost structure. Can't tell you how many times I get somebody goes online, pulls a flyer, it says $17 a foot, and then they see the square footage, and they add it all up. They come to us and say, hey, this is great, it's gonna work, just wanna confirm that the cost is this. Surprise, if you see triple net, there's gonna be a lot more on top of that. I've had more people get frustrated and almost to the point of where it does feel a little bit like misadvertising. Anytime anybody sees 3 ends, the first thing that should go up is there's going to be more cost. To really simply break it down, all triple net means is just your base rent. In addition to that, 9 times out of 10, you'll have operating expenses, which include property taxes, property insurance, and then common area maintenance. Believe it or not, the landlord's not going to carry all those for your type of use. They're going to pass that on to you. So I can't reiterate enough. Anytime you see that 3N, your first question is, what are the operating expenses? Some other things that come up are TI costs, amortization. This is where Brandon's expertise in the construction world really helps people kind of identify what's the total cost of the project and how is that going to affect our budget. So those are the 3 kind of big things as you're trying to figure out what the ultimate cost of the space is going to be. The last couple things, Dan touched a little bit on this. How long are you willing to sign? We're doing deals that are 15 years long for people that are in the institutional world. They're trying to lock their costs today. We're doing deals that are 2 to 3 years. Somebody that really wants to put their foot in the water, find a space that gets them up and running, or they could be in a transition phase where they're a fast growth company. There's a lot of different things that come up. One thing that Dan touched on is we do see a lot of people negotiating longer term leases that have termination rights or relocation rights within those leases. So how long are you willing to sign plays a huge role on how much your cost will actually be, especially if there's construction involved. If there's a lot of construction, people are going to want you to sign longer term. And then the last thing, again, for smaller companies, getting to that lease phase. I'm not an attorney. I've been doing this for 16 years, and there's still things in the leases that surprise me. I always recommend finding either a local attorney, somebody who has real estate expertise, or if you have that, if you have access to somebody in-house, definitely tap that. But sometimes to supplement your in-house legal with somebody that's really real estate driven, knows the zoning, knows the property tax codes, things like that. That's a really fast process of a step-by-step process of what can take anywhere from a week to 12 months in some cases.
And as a landlord, 3 years minimum. If you want any type of TI, anything as far as build out, most landlords are going to say 5 years. If you want some free months of rent, maybe you're stretching it to 7. If so basically, we're as a landlord, you're looking for a rate of return, and then sometimes it's an investor-led property, so they're looking for long-term stability, so that they might be able to get a long-term revenue stream for them, or be able to market it on the open market for sale.
Yeah, I think the key thing there is to make sure the lease costs, the operating expenses, the lease structure, you're modeling those costs over time, but make sure you're also putting in your budget, your operating budget, the technology costs for your internet and phone service, your, do you have lending capacity? Do you have the capital reserves to actually, perform the construction improvements yourselves? Do you negotiate with the landlord to try to receive more tenant improvement allowance? So there's a lot to consider, and I just would challenge everybody to make sure you do that. If you think it's something, anybody here, we could give you an idea pretty quickly of the things to model at a minimum. So, call on your professional in the industry and they'll help you with that. But a big piece of that is making sure it's going to meet your business plan. You're going to hit the profit margin you need to be to maintain your business levels. So, and then just one other item. I think we talked a lot about the landlord concessions. And we say TI. You want to explain that a little more?
Basically, landlord concessions, when you're looking at a space, whether it be in an office building or a retail strip, there's a couple different terms. I'm not sure if we have them on here, but
I don't think we do.
They can be, a lot of times you'll hear gray box, vanilla box. Those are just different terms. They're kind of loose terms. Gray box generally means and correct me if you guys have a different definition of it, but generally what that is it's, stripped down, you have your HVAC, everything's in place, you come in, drywall, put your fixtures in, all that. Vanilla box is drywalled, everything done except for your fixtures for whatever your business may be, desks, things like that. So.
And don't expect flooring, sometimes paint.
Well, it's all negotiable. That's kind of one of the things here that with all this stuff in commercial real estate is there's a lot of negotiating room, and that's good for the landlord and that's good for the tenant. And it's not like renting an apartment where you go in and here's the lease, here's the terms, you sign it, and here you go. Your broker will be able to guide you on what is negotiable, what is not negotiable, you know, where they think that they might be able to create value for you, which is ultimately the goal of the broker. So for the TIs, you know, the landlord may be willing to do X for you in, you know, exchange for extra long lease term, not extra long, but a few years. He might be saying, hey, you can take the space for 2 years as is. You know, it's just it all depends on, one, the motivation of the landlord, how, you know, capable the tenant is, how strong the tenant is, and, you know, circumstances, kind of like any other transaction.
And no two landlords are the same, and no two leases are going to be the same. Is that fair? Yeah.
So you're in R&R space.
Well, R&R, yeah. But our lease is nowhere close to R&R's lease, and the suite of services are totally different between our groups. And you know, you're dealing with mostly single net, and you know, going into a single net is a whole different story, because now you're responsible for the care and upkeep of the exterior portions, interior portions, everything. So tons of scenarios to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Justin said, you know, we're focusing on, I believe, mainly on just a lease transaction here. So typical timeline for a lease transaction search to rent commencement, 6 months, generally speaking. And the last one is a lease legally binding. So there's one thing on here I want to clarify, the difference between a letter of intent and a lease. And this is a big one, and something that a lot of people get hung up on. Letter of intent is a non-legally binding agreement. That's laying out the basic terms of the deal to go to lease negotiations. So what you're going to be doing in this process, you're be negotiating with the landlord on, you know, your rent, your term, the tenant improvement allowances, you know, anything extra as far as, like, do you need dedicated parking stalls, do you need janitorial, all the different things you need, I guess basic things you need. And then from there, if you can agree upon those terms, you move into the lease document, which is where we recommend you seek legal advice from a contract attorney, real estate attorney, to go through that to make sure there's nothing else in there that will get you snagged up on the lease. Once that's completed, then it's legally binding, and you have a transaction.
Yeah, so that is why the LOI process is there, so that you're not spending money with lawyers, billing by the minute, and trying to hash out those terms. Those are all things that the tenant and landlord can get hashed out pretty darn close, and then it's, you know, where you dot your I's and dot your T's in the lease.
And it's not just, yeah, and it's not just cost for the tenant too on that. The landlord, if you were to go straight to a lease or purchase agreement or whatnot, the landlord's going to be spending money on attorney's fees as well. So this is just to simplify the process. Luckily, you know, the landlords here in town, we live in a great community in Des Moines, they're going to honor the LOI, even though it's technically not legally binding. Something may come up, the deal might not get signed, but the general terms of the deal will 9 times out of 10 stay the same. Would you guys agree? So that's a nod to Des Moines, and, you know, we're not in New York or LA where people are going to, not everyone, but, you know, it's a little more aggressive markets, you know. So
I've had a lease come back that they didn't put any of the changes of the LOI because it was at the care and discretion of the tenant to hire legal attorney to go ahead and put in all those particulars, and they were hoping that things got missed or not addressed. So those are also things where make sure that LOI accompanies the lease when you send it to the attorney.
Yeah, I just think the last thing as you look at your use, your organization, if there's anything that is non-standard, your professionals will know, and they'll make sure to put that in the LOI so that some of these major, you know, potentially breaking points get addressed early. You don't want to try to hide something until leasing, because then you're going to spend a lot of money with legal and then potentially lose the deal, and then maybe you've lost out on your second or third option during that time because they were leased. So sounds basic, but it's important to make sure if there's a special use, or you really need a sign, or you need dedicated parking, or you have, you're planning to cook food, whatever it is, it needs to be in there. So, want to move to the next one?
Yep. And so we have it up there. On the next slide here, this is basically, we're going over the different lease types. And so what you have on the top is your triple net lease. Simple, for the tenant, ABC store, whatever it may be, 5-year lease is in here. 1,000 square feet is the square footage of your space. On a triple net lease, if you recall, the base rent that's the rent you're paying to the landlord to be there. That doesn't include any expenses. So you're paying $10 a foot to be there, so that's $833 a month. Your taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance, those are fixed costs for the site. So that'll vary from site to site. And, that'll be, I've just plugged in $5 here, round numbers. So you're paying $416 a month in taxes, insurance, and CAM. So monthly rental payment to the landlord of $1,250. Keep in mind also on this lease structure that generally spaces are separately metered for utilities and water. So if you're a heavy water user, heavy electric user, what have you, internet, if you need special, that's on you as well. So that's not, I didn't put that in here, but it depends on your needs. And
Right, it's different.
yeah, it's different for every tenant. So on this analysis here of your basic triple net, with your CAMs, you're going to end up paying $15,000 a year to the landlord. And not to go too deep in, but the CAM, the common area maintenance, that's your lawn care, your snow removal, general maintenance of the outside of the building, roof, what have you, and that gets adjusted yearly. So if we have a heavy snowfall year, you could be billed more. If we have less of a snowfall year, you'll get a refund. So, yeah, anything to add on that? Okay, moving on. Modified gross lease. Basically, this is just a negotiable lease. You have a base rent, and you have, I put in here your taxes, insurance, CAM, but the other things can be negotiable. Your utilities could be thrown in here, your phone, your internet. Modified gross is a very open-ended term. So what I showed here, same deal, 5-year lease, 1,000 square feet, 10 foot. It's not necessarily cheaper, and I should have done this when I was making this. It's just showing 13,000, but that's more expenses that I guess the tenant would be taking on. Maybe you can get a cheaper fiber line or what have you. So that's the deal with that.
Would you also see sometimes the landlords potentially, you mentioned on the triple net, it's exterior roof, the building structure, waterproofing.
That's in a multi-tenant center.
Yeah, but on a modified gross, and this can be in any deal, but what I've seen a lot more is the landlord might warrant, it's an existing building, they might warrant the heating and electric systems for a period of time, because after that, those systems become the responsibility of the tenant. And in a shell, obviously you're building it in new, but I think those are some things that you'll want to look at when you're...
Yeah, and that's, comes down to the document. So that's where we've been kind of stressing the document, and that's where you want to pay special attention to that. But do you want to touch on, your modified gross on an office building, large office park, kind of what's included in that?
Yeah, in Des Moines, if you rewind 10 years ago, if you were looking for office space, somebody quoted you a rate. A lot of times it was a gross rate. Could be subject to change. Every year, a landlord's going to look at how much it snowed and do they need more cash to cover that. But in short, if they said, hey, it's $16 a foot gross, as a tenant, you should feel pretty comfortable that most of your costs are going to be included in that. There's been a pretty big shift. A lot of the work that I do in this market is office-driven, so particularly close to have seen the transition from gross leases to really triple net leases. And we talked a lot about what that is. A triple net lease is just, here's your base rent, you're paying for the air, and then you've got the operating expenses that are in addition to all of that. I would echo the fact that a modified gross lease you tend to see in landlords that have owned property for maybe a longer period of time. They've depreciated the asset. Maybe they're willing to absorb part of the cost as just an opportunity to get the deal. So
maybe it's too expensive to split utilities.
Right. Yep. So it definitely changes. And really, even with utilities, as an office user, you could look at a building like 801 Grand, for example. There's 900,000 square feet. I can promise you there's not 100 meters. It's 1 meter that comes into the space, and basically you pay a proportionate share of your utility costs. So there's this whole other world of proportionate costs that you get into, particularly as an office tenant, not as much as a retail tenant, because you do tend to have your little bay, your little box that's separately metered, and easier to track the costs. So the one thing, again, I would just say over and over again is as you're looking for space, really challenge the landlord as to all of the costs and how they're handled year one and how they're reconciled every year forward. I've had a lot of folks go sign a lease, a 5-year deal, and think that, okay, I've got my number, my year one cost, and assume it's the same for all 5 years, and find out year 3, 8 years ago, we get 12 inches of snow every time it snows, and that costs money. And the landlord, again, especially in a triple net lease, is not going to absorb that. So you just got to be really mindful as to what costs are year one, inclusive of everything, and what they look like moving forward.
Or if there's a tax abatement, not realizing that this new construction is going to, it doesn't have any tax built in there because it's a brand new building and it hasn't been assessed, or it's been in a tax abatement zone. Those things also impact you. And then another thing that I'd also say on that is sometimes it's not in your advantage because with a modified gross, because you go to a strip center and maybe they have a bar at the end and they're a heavy water user. And because it's a modified gross, you're actually paying for the water that they're using because it's not separately metered and you're doing a proportionate share, not a share of what you actually use. So that could be a big thing for you, especially if there's not separately metered conditions in a building.
Right, and just to clarify, for the common area maintenance, the taxes, insurance, you're going to be paying your proportionate share of the center, office building, industrial park, what have you. So the percentage, whatever your percentage of square feet that you have for that building is what you're going to end up paying. And then just lastly is your gross lease, which is the simplest lease of them all. 1,000 square feet, $10 a foot, all in, $833 a month. You're paying $10,000 a year, and that's the gross lease.
What may not be included in that?
Yeah.
Janitorial.
Meaning, as those are the two I was thinking of.
And IT, yeah.
So, anyways, looks like we're at the end here. You wanna?
Do we have time for questions? A quick final comment is, and if anybody wants to jump in, please. There's a lot of really fun, exciting topics with real estate. I mean, we're talking about some really basic triple net, kind of the military style language acronyms, but I think all of us are in this industry for a reason. It's fun. I mean, it's not as overwhelming as you'd think if you do the right research and you engage the right people. Brandon and I could sit here and talk all day about some of the really cool office trends. These guys who lean a lot more retail could talk about how Amazon is affecting, the Yonkers building. We sent a great presentation this morning about, how big box trends are really shifting and whether it's senior living or entertainment are hitting that. We love to talk about that stuff too. So I get random calls like that as well where people are just asking for our take on the economy, on market rents, is it a landlord market or a tenant market? We didn't get into any of that stuff today, but those are always things that we all love to talk about as well. So I would challenge you if you're out making real decisions, whether it's, asking what the coolest office trend is or why would I go to Ankeny versus West Des Moines? That's where you really get into the fun stuff. But first you got to know what triple net means.
Yeah. Are there any questions about anything that we've talked about?
What you negotiated with your landlord.
So basically, how do you protect yourself the best that you can? And I would say it's the team and the expertise that you're establishing around yourself to ask all the right questions and protect yourself against those anomalies. We all know what those things can be, but I get slapped across the head with something that I haven't seen. I did a church We went into a space that was big enough to accomplish all the assembly type, well, to be able to have that many people in that space, it was allowable by fire code. But it wasn't zoned or structured or architecturally planned for assembly, which meant that they had to do a ton of work on modifying the space to allow things. So we all have our stories. Do you have
I would just
some protection stories?
Yeah, well, and to be honest with you, I think from Brandon's perspective probably as well, once you've spent the time to work through all of the zoning, the code stuff, you're supposed to be there, right? You've signed a contract, you're in the building. Through the foreclosure crisis especially, there were a ton of buildings that weren't sold, because that happens every day, but actually went back to the bank. There was a lot of regulation that occurred that actually brought tenant protection through that as well. So the long and short of it is if you've signed a lease and the landlord signed a lease and that building sells, you're protected. You're in that building, you're using it, they can't kick you out. There's certainly, in some cases, some buildings downtown have tenants that have grown, right? And they've pushed other users out of that building. Those users that are in that building that are in a direct lease are protected 100%. Could they be bought out? Sure. Could they terminate? Yeah. But once you have that lease, you're good.
Yeah, it's the language in the lease that protects the transfer of the asset ownership.
And like residential protections are this big, commercial real estate protections are about that. So it is the lease that dictates it when you go to court.
As long as the tenant's not in default.
That's the biggest key.
Yes.
So,
Minor detail.
yeah, minor detail there. Yeah.
Pay your bills.
Any other questions?
I need to look for with somebody in an existing space who is growing and moving out, and me possibly going in and taking over.
So your question is about subleasing.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with that. I mean, I list a lot of sublease space as well. So the example is fast forward, that company's outgrown that space, and or for whatever reason they closed, or maybe they were acquired and they shut down that division. There's a million different reasons why we get space that's in mid-term. So 5-year term, there's 2 years left. You want to go absorb that space. You've now essentially started down a path where you're negotiating directly with that tenant. The tenant's contract will hold with the landlord. So you're working within some set parameters. So it's a lot different than if you were going direct to a landlord to say, hey, here's what I need, 5-year fresh clean lease, give me some cash to build my space out, and here's the rate I want. All of that changes when you go into that sublease model. It's now the tenant that, in 9 times out of 10 of their case, they're gonna discount the rent and not give you cash because they probably need their capital for something else. Whereas a landlord's a lot more likely to say, here's some startup money to build your space out.
Are you just asking about going into a space that's been previously occupied? Yeah, I don't think it's but it's occupied now and they have a lease remaining? Okay, so that's not very long. So it's not really a sublease. It's more of a second gen.
Yep.
So you just want to evaluate the space, bring a professional in. There's professionals that will do a walkthrough at no charge to give you initial feedback on things they have. You can also hire a more formal review. You probably at some point, if you're seriously considering it, should bring on a team to do a code review and a construction review. It depends on the space, but you need to understand what's staying, what can change, what can't change. So it's really, you're starting the same process. I would say, I don't know, more often than not, I'm working on projects where somebody else was already in the space before. And so it's a little different. There's different nuances from new construction in a shell space to a second generation space, but ultimately the same things have to happen. The advantages and potential disadvantage, you may get to use some of the existing build out in a way that works for you, but you have to evaluate that.
One thing that we also didn't talk about with site identification is restrictions. Landlords can put restrictions on who they will and will not lease to. They can put restrictions on saying, hey, we have a Subway in this building, so there is no other sandwich shop that can go into this building. There are a lot of things that way that you might not know going into a project of saying, oh, well, and especially if you go into a sublease, you might be told no because the landlord says that you have a restricted use. So I can't take you on as a tenant, even though that you've negotiated everything with the current tenant on a sublease. So even though things are negotiated, still get a professional to help you out through that.
Anything else? I would typically say it's your design professional. So the architectural team, the landlord may help, the broker may get involved. I'd say that typically lands on an organization like ours. We'll meet with the municipalities, we'll review the layout. There's code restrictions depending on your use. Each municipality has slightly different versions of that. So that's really where the expertise and the licensure comes in. And a lot of times the brokers are gonna also know how to facilitate to folks as well. So sometimes you don't have a team to start, but ultimately the team gets built some way through. So that's why I just recommend build it early, because you're gonna wanna work with the right people versus waiting until something comes up and then you have to have a team added because they have the expertise. That's one thing we didn't talk a lot about. There are multiple expertise in this industry.
Tons of layers.
Specific licenses, civil engineering, environmental, architectural, mechanical, electrical, structural engineering. It's kind of seems endless. Depending on the project, you may or may not have to get into that level of detail. And a lot of times you can hire a prime consultant to just build that team for you, or you have organizations that have a lot of that team already in place. So it just depends.
Parking is another one that we should have probably highlighted on the different types of uses. So retail requires more parking, industrial requires very little parking. But if you want to put a go-kart track in an industrial center, the city might say, nope, not going to happen. So there's different rules like that, and I wouldn't say that any one entity has any of that blame, but really it should be the real estate agent working with you, realizing some of those things that could come up, and trying to avoid all of those speed bumps.
Yeah, and when you're going into a space or providing, intending to change the use, no matter how great your team is, you're still at the discretion of that city, and ultimately it goes to city council many times, and so you have an opportunity, not to actually be able to move in or use that space as intended. So make sure you're doing those things early. We'll all tell you that. Anybody else you'll bring on will tell you that too. You don't want to sign a lease and then find you can't get in. You want to be an LOI stage, go through that, investment of time and cost before you sign the lease.
And the landlord might hold you accountable because you've spent that time and effort, and okay, now you need to find somebody else to sublease it, and you're still on the hook because you have a personal guarantee. Not saying that'll happen all the time, but I've seen it.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. We appreciate being here. And if anybody has, do you have a question? We do. Well, we can provide it, and we can also provide your cards.
Yep, I can get this out to you guys if you want to reach out to me too. I can make sure you guys get appropriate information.
Yeah, and then if anybody wants, we'll pass out cards if we haven't already. So, thank you.
Want to thank you guys once again for taking time out of your schedule today to join us. Again, just housekeeping, make sure that you fill out the survey for me. If you're watching this online, I know you don't have a survey in front of you, but if you need or feel the need to leave comments on how we can make things better, please email them to myself or Christina. And again, don't forget to join us for the top 5 things for your website. That'll be taking place Wednesday, May 23rd at 11:30. The speaker will be Happy Medium. You can register online at dsmpartnership.com/events. Thanks for joining us.